Welcome to our community. Susie Thomas with you this morning. We are visiting with Dr. Michael Polnick. He is Director of Operations at Pregnancy Choices, but that's not exactly why he's here today. He is the person who the podcaster of orthodoxy and bioethics.
Yeah.
Two great big words, Mike.
They are, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, let's talk. First of all, why a podcast? What led you that direction? What interests you in this area so that's what you want to do?
Right, sure. So what happened was, well, I think we'll get into my story in a little bit. But for me, doing academic philosophy and theology was interesting. But there's a part of me that wanted to be very practical and do something with it. So after some searching, I went up to Case, and then I got my master's in clinical ethics from Case Western Reserve, the School of Medicine, and I focused in end-of-life issues and theological ethics. And then I ended going on further and getting my doctorate from Albany Medical School in bioethics and policy. And because I am an Eastern Christian, there's not a lot of work done with the Eastern Orthodox or the Eastern Christian churches in bioethics. There are some thinkers out there, but there's not a lot for the parishioners, the everyday people walking around and then working in the hospitals. So I kind of thought maybe there would be people that would be interested in my particular way of thinking about medical ethics. So I emailed Ancient Faith Radio, and they said, yeah, we've been looking for somebody like you to do this. And I started it a while ago. I took a little hiatus, and it's back on track now. And essentially what I do is I explore the method of thinking about medical ethics and then some specific cases and specific issues that the Orthodox Christian, but then people outside our church would face as well.
And to really put this in layman's terms, medical ethics, it's like this, and you tell me where I'm wrong thinking here. We all love J.R. Smith, and any Cavs fan was rooting for him when he announced that he and his wife were going to be having another baby girl. And then just only 22 weeks after her birth, announced that she had been born. That is not even halfway through a pregnancy.
Right.
Everybody knowing that at 22 weeks in most states, not Ohio, gratefully, in most states, 22 weeks, a person could terminate a pregnancy and not think anything of it, walk away, and it would be totally legal.
Right.
Everybody was rooting for this little girl to make it, and so happy to announce that at this point, isn't she something like 6 pounds and doing well? She's growing miraculously. This is a miracle baby.
Right.
So at one point, bioethics makes me ask these questions. This 22-week-old person that, boy, at that age, you really don't even know completely whether it's a boy or a girl yet.
Right.
And yet, here's this little baby girl who is born, that we're all rooting for. How do you connect those dots and navigate that? Am I thinking about this right?
Yeah.
And that is what bioethics is about.
Yeah, and it can extend everywhere from stem cell research to cloning issues to organ transplant to end-of-life issues like euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, active, passive, voluntary, involuntary euthanasia, and in my specialty, theological ethics, but then even extending into policy or universal health care or, the concept of what is health. And if we had universal health care, who would pay for it? How would we know it's a good program? What are the markers? Those kinds of things.
So, the orthodoxy part then is the part that says, all right, where does God fit into all of this?
Right. Yeah. Where does God fit into it? And then how would you navigate? Because the Orthodox churches are a little, theologically different than some of the other churches. What we look at is kind of two aspects of it. One would be, what would the church, and I'm making air quotes, teach on certain things? And then that may even vary by church. But then the other thing I try to explore is, how does an Orthodox Christian or a Christian in general work within a context that may not share their same Christian values?
A great lead into what I was about to ask you next. If a person, help us with apologetics on these kinds of things. When a person is in the situation where the topic of stem cell research, how does a Christian respond to that?
Well, I think it would be the context. If you're working at a hospital system, one hospital would answer those questions differently than another. And I try to tell my students, I'm an adjunct at Walsh, and if you're at Altman, your questions and your bioethics, so to speak, will look a little different than they would at Mercy, because the mission of the hospital is different. The understanding of life is different.
True.
They both value life. I understand that. I'm not trying to put Altman down by any stretch. But Mercy,
no, but one's a Catholic hospital.
Right. And
yes.
those things play into the reality
yes.
of it. So I think as you look at stem cells, we have to even look at the politics behind the language. When we say adult stem cell, the mind thinks, well, this must be somebody that's 18 years or older. But it's not. You can get an adult stem cell from a very, very young person. So the idea of embryonic stem cells, how do we get the stem cells? Is it ethical? Even when George Bush was faced with this issue of the frozen embryos,
yes.
they're going to be destroyed. What do you do with them? And these are the kind of things that I kind of grapple with, and I try to help other people come to their own conclusions on. I don't believe that in my field it's my job to start dictating. They need to do this, they need to do that. It's more of a process of this is what our church would say, this is what the scriptures would say.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to answer these questions? Because they're so complicated in each situation that you can make kind of large blanket philosophical or theological positions, but then applying them in each situation is where the skill set comes into place.
So if we tune into your podcast, mm-hmm. how high above our heads are you talking? Or is this something that the average person can really glean from?
It's geared for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly an average person. And one of the humbling things is I receive emails from all over the world. I received an email from a Spanish person living in Bulgaria on what to do with an issue.
Wow.
So when I pull up my phone, sometimes I look and I'm like, there's somebody in Canada that's curious on how to answer these things. And it's difficult because these questions can be often vague. And I don't want to give specific answers because I'm not aware of the variable context of the situation. So I try to give general, positions on things, and then always advise them to seek local counsel,
mm-hmm.
Either legal or theological, for their specific issue, because it's difficult to make blanket statements on things. As far as when I say that, the questions are never, should we have an abortion or not? Those are never the questions I get. I get these complicated questions of, if someone's doing this and then this is this, how would this be this? And because I don't have the time to enter into a large dialogue,
yes.
I give them the parameters, and then I always advise them to go seek specific questions.
So you're able to direct them to where to go for more information as
mm-hmm.
well, not just come to that podcast for the answers.
Sure.
Because I think one of the things, like taking stem cell research,
mm-hmm.
for example, I think the concern with embryonic stem cell research is that, my goodness, where are you getting the embryos? Are these
right.
unborn babies?
Mm-hmm.
And is this going to lead that slippery slope of harvesting unborn
right.
babies strictly to be able to do medical research and
mm-hmm.
make a person who's post-birth
right.
get better rather than the preborn person,
right.
but recognizing as believers both are persons,
yes.
both are people.
Yeah.
Where the adult stem cell research is this person who has been born that we're still able to unbelievably take from a cell
mm-hmm.
and able to create
right.
parts of the body
technically,
that could replace something that's ill.
Sure. And the idea of adult and embryonic
mm-hmm.
is essentially the idea that the stem cell's been turned on or turned off. So the cell has been, quote, turned on to turn into another cell.
Yes.
So you can get an adult stem cell from a very, 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 very young person.
So interesting.
It does not have to be someone that's, because we hear the word, adult, and we automatically think 18 and older. Well, as soon as the cell's been turned on, that's when it becomes adult.
So it's when a cell turns on. It doesn't have to show its ID.
No.
And I understand embryonic stem that it's not as successful so far with mm-hmm. embryonic stem cells
right.
as with adult stem cells. That with embryonic stem cell research, again, correct me if I'm wrong,
mm-hmm.
something I've heard or read was that you're never quite sure what you're going to get. It's like Forrest Gump and the box of chocolates. You're not
mm-hmm.
quite sure what you're going to get.
Right.
As opposed to with an adult stem cell, if I'm wanting to grow a new something, that's the something I'm going to be growing.
Right.
Do I have that right?
Essentially, yeah. And what you find is a lot of the arguments for the embryonic or the stem cell research is difficult to prove. It's something that we discuss in class where people would have a theoretical belief. And, in science, to prove something, you have to be able to demonstrate it over
mm-hmm.
and over again. And the difficulty is to begin to test these theories to see if they would work. You would have to destroy so many embryos to even begin to do the research.
Stop right there. Exactly.
That's the thing. So when people will come to me and say, well, are you okay? Why do you want this disease to continue? It becomes a question of the way they think about ethics. And that's something I really stress in my classes and on my podcast is the way the mind's shaped on these things, because all of us have a moral process that we almost unconsciously use.
Yeah.
And we use like thought experiments where I'll say, if it's the classic trolley problem, where if you're standing there and you have the lever, there's one person on the track A that's a single person, track B has 5, the train's not stopping. My students were always like, what if there's a miracle? I'm like, okay, of course, it could be miracles.
We always hope.
Right. But, how would it work? Then what we do is we try to learn what their unconscious process is. And then at the same time, I say, well, what if that one person was your mom? And then the 5 were complete strangers or they were bad people? And
so throwing in some situational ethics there.
Right, because most people would be a utilitarian, so they would want the greatest amount of good. But what you realize is that idea of the greatest amount of good can be flipped situationally, because if it's someone you really care about, you're automatically going to feel pulled towards that.
You must have had a heyday when the Planned Parenthood videos were released on YouTube and social media. Did you cover those on the podcast? Did you touch on those?
I'd be
interested in hearing have you seen them?
I've seen enough.
I'm interested in hearing your take on all of that. How do we get to a point morally, ethically, where anybody says that's okay?
How did we get there, or how do we correct it?
Well, both. Thanks.
Okay. Sure. I think how we got there was a slow, systemic process of devaluing human persons. I think if we look at the legal precedent for Roe v. Wade, and even if you look at, the Casey or, Johnson control, that case, the idea of what it means to be a human person is paramount in these things. And one of the things that I felt comfortable with being educated in a, quote, secular environment was I really learned the other side of it. I really was able to be immersed. And when I say secular, I don't mean that everyone was, pro-life or pro-choice. It was just a different thing than what I got. I got my undergrad at Walsh, so it was a different experience. So you look and you say, well, we have to respect human persons, and of course we do. But I think what we can find over time is that the idea of respecting human persons has slowly become devalued in our society. So it doesn't surprise me, because one of the things you'll hear is, we prove that it's a person. It's like, well, of course we should. But at the same time, are the people that is arguing this position, the people that are experiencing it, value the human person all the time. They don't have this break, this consistent ethic. And I think because what it does is, number one, to the detractors, it would point out this, well, you're like this, but yet you also do this, which you're never going to satisfy all those arguments.
Right.
But I think a consistent, compassionate Christian nation and understanding of how to take care of all people, people that are suffering, people that are hungry, that I think makes it easier.
So that's how we correct it?
I would think so. I would think by acknowledging that they are persons, and then at the same time saying, well, how do we treat how do we treat everybody? Because, even as the cases would move forward, there's this idea, once Roe v. Wade gets flipped, they would think that it would be, well, that was elective abortions. And some bigger questions I think we should all grapple with is, what are causing, what's the emotional, biopsychosocial that these, people are struggling with? And one thing that I'm very cognizant about is the fact that I will never have that experience of what they're going through. I'm limited by my gender and my upbringing, and I know that. So in a sense, mine can only be abstract kind of knowledge on these things. But I think entering into the people suffering like Christ did and being with them and walking with them.
Yes. For me, it's the slavery issue of our generation. And again, it was devaluing a human being.
Right.
It seems like that's happened all over again.
Yeah.
Much of what you do with Pregnancy Choices is addressing the suffering of the people, presenting them. Here are your options. Consider adoption. You could bless another family.
Right.
with the birth of this baby, but you have options. Look at all of them before you rashly make a decision and terminate a life. Goodness, look at the time. We're going to have to take a short little break. We'll be back after these words. You're listening to Our Community.